For more on this story, let's bring in Anastasios Sextos, a professor of earthquake engineering at the University of Bristol. Thanks so much for being with us here on France 24. Before I ask you about some technical engineering matters, you yourself were in an earthquake at a young age that really sort of changed the trajectory of your life. Can you just briefly tell us about that?
Well, everybody who lives in an earthquake region has experienced not one but multiple earthquakes, and this always leaves a signature in our DNA. So it's very important always to try to work as citizens, as scientists, to help the society recover in case of earthquakes and be also prepared.
Right, so you sort of know what these people are going through. When you look at the buildings in Morocco, especially in those remote areas of the mountains, we're talking about structures here that just aren't built to withstand shaking to this degree. Isn't that the case?
That's exactly the case, actually, because Morocco, as you know, is not considered to be a high seismic region as we define probably Turkey or California or Japan. It was considered to be a moderate seismicity region with a very large earthquake happening a century ago and a 5.8 happening in 1960. Now, the problem obviously here is that both the earthquake is very strong and the buildings are very weak. Most of them are built with mud bricks, that's earth stones, let us say, which make them particularly vulnerable to earthquakes. And this is the combination of the two, the convolution of the two, the hazard, the earthquake that is, and the weakness of the buildings led to this tragic toll.
What about the situation in Marrakesh? That's a big city, 1 million people. From an engineering perspective, were the structures there in a better position to withstand a big earthquake like this?
Well, not necessarily. First of all, when there is lack of awareness, because there is no proper earthquake culture, if you like, from the seismic history of the current country, then there is no preparedness. And this applies everywhere to the legislative framework, to the seismic codes that perhaps they could have been more advanced, quality control, type of construction. Marrakesh is a big city, which means that the exposure is higher, more people, more probability of buildings to collapse.
Well, when you're talking about making a building seismically safe, of course, it's expensive. As Morocco looks to rebuild, are there relatively low-cost ways to engineer buildings in a better way so that the damage isn't as devastating if another quake strikes?
That's a very good question, actually. There are low-cost solutions to strengthen old structures, substandard structures, those that have not built to the current seismic codes. And there are low-cost solutions to protect new buildings from collapsing. The problem in Morocco and in most low to moderate income countries is that the building stock is such that is very hard to retrofit ahead of the next earthquake, because there are so many residential buildings. They're so weakly built. They're built, like I said, from mudstone, mud masonry. It is practically impossible at this large scale to strengthen buildings ahead of the next earthquake. So this essentially is not a technical problem. It's a financial problem, it's a social problem, and there is a safety gap between different countries, different income of countries, if you like, development level of countries, that we need to bridge using technology, but also political will.
You briefly mentioned the last big earthquake in Morocco. That was in 1960, a 5.8 that killed some 12,000 people. Were there any lessons that were learned from that quake from an engineering perspective?
Well, the lesson that we learn from these earthquakes is that an earthquake that has a magnitude of 5.8, which is not considered to be a strong one, led to thousands of people dying. The same magnitude of earthquake in California would lead to 1% of the loss, probably. In Japan, 1%. This shows what I said, the huge seismic gap, because seismic risk is the combination of how weak the societies are, the communities are, the buildings are, with respect to resisting the earthquakes. And that's why I said previously that it's a social problem.
How long do you expect it will take Morocco to rebuild?
I'm afraid it will take some time, but rebuild is one. First of all, now we need to obviously focus on the search and rescue operations for the next 48 hours, because time is of essence, obviously. But then for the next set of years, I would say, because we're talking of a loss which is a percentage of the GDP, it could be 2%, 3%, 5%. That's the order of magnitude for these disasters. It will take some years to recover. The most important thing for Morocco, in my humble opinion, is to try to develop the culture of earthquake resistance, revise seismic codes, enforce the application and implementation of the seismic codes, and try, with the aid of the international community, to build safer, using local solutions that can help the people who are in need not to experience such an event in the future.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Anastasios Sextos, Professor of Earthquake Engineering at the University of Bristol. Thanks so much for joining us here on France 24.
You're most welcome.